Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast. Hello there. So the series on the Battle of Bautzen has come to an end, and I'm currently busy writing and recording the next series, which will focus on the Battle of Berlin. But I thought it was a bit mean to make you wait too long for new content. So in order to bridge the gap and keep you going until the next series on Berlin is released, I will be sharing a couple of interviews I conducted recently with some experts on the Second World War. And the best thing about these experts is that they, like me, also have a passion for the complexities, peculiarities, and horrors of the Eastern Front. For today's episode, I spoke with Scott Burry from the excellent Beyond Barbarossa podcast to hear his insights on a range of topics including the professionalization of the Red Army throughout the war, or perhaps lack thereof, and the tactics and strategies employed by the Red Army to defeat the Germans. The Beyond Barbarossa podcast tells the entire story of the Eastern Front, from Operation Barbarossa onwards. So naturally, I also asked Scott just how he approaches the task of researching and telling the story of such a huge front of the war. Okay, that's enough from me for now. I hope you enjoy our chat. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the Europe at War podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm glad we could find time in our schedules to have you on for an interview. I'm very excited to introduce you to our listeners. How are you feeling today?
Oh, I'm very well. Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be here to join your podcast.
Fantastic.
Say, I really enjoy listening to your podcast every week.
Thank you, Scott. That's very, very kind of you to say. I can also return the mutual love there and say that I'm trying to hold up to your standards when it comes to having a podcast about the Eastern Front. Yours is way out ahead of mine in terms of quality and content. But I'm just very excited to talk to someone who's as passionately kind of interested with the Eastern Front as I am. Perfect. So I'll kick off with just asking you to kind of give a little intro, like who are you, what brought you to the topic of the Eastern Front in general, and what is the kind of scope and format of the Beyond Barbarossa podcast?
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, Beyond Barbarossa is my podcast on the Eastern Front, and until January this year, it was the only English language podcast that focused exclusively on the Eastern Front. But now I've got Europe at War to work into my dialogue here. And yeah, so as far as what brought me here, I'm professionally a journalist. I've been a journalist for close to 40 years, I guess now, and always been interested in the wider scope, and also always interested in history.
Mhm.
And even as a teenager and starting to learn about history, it struck me how little we in Canada anyway get in terms of the history of Russia, the Russian Empire, Eastern Europe. And then I started to realize at one point, yeah, we don't really learn a whole lot when we are learning in history in high school and at university about the Second World War, the Eastern side of it. It struck me when I did look into it just how much larger that side of it was. That was the bulk of the fighting. That was the Germans had something like 4 to 5 times the resources dedicated to the Eastern Front as they did on the West, especially after 1941. Uh, so I just thought, well, it's time to delve into that. Then, full disclosure, yes, my wife is Ukrainian Canadian, and her father was born in Canada, but in 1941 was living in 1939 he was living in Poland, which then, as you know, was divided between the USSR and Germany, and so became a Soviet citizen. And so in 1941 he was drafted into the Red Army, much against his will, and fought from Kiev back to Kharkiv, where he was captured and starved in a POW camp
Oh, wow.
until he escaped. And so I wrote a book about that. And then when podcasting started to really catch on, I thought, I could do a podcast about the Eastern Front. And so here we are. I
Very
launched,
good.
it launched on June 22nd, 2022 or 2020. Yes, 2022.
Hmm.
So we're coming up to 3 years now. And I've been trying to roughly track the development of the war on the East on a chronological basis.
Hmm.
So I'm up to 1944 now. And one of the aspects or one of the things I'm trying to accomplish with this in terms of tracking it chronologically is also to show what's happening on the Eastern Front concurrently with developments elsewhere. So
Right.
while in 1941, Germany was advancing very rapidly across the USSR.
Mm.
Also, there was fighting in North Africa.
Mm.
And in 1943, we have action in Italy and so on.
Hmm.
So I have a section, I always devote a few minutes toward the beginning of each episode, a section called What Else is Happening in the War? So to show while I'm talking about these events in the Eastern Front, this other stuff is happening on the Western Front. And I think that really provides a lot of context.
Absolutely. My first question was about that was going to be to ask, how do you handle the scope of the Eastern Front in general? And then you kind of one-upped me by saying not only do you cover the Eastern Front, but then you also tie it into developments elsewhere at the same time,
Yeah.
which is incredible. But maybe to still return to my question, I mean, the Eastern Front is vast, and even if you take
Yes.
a chronological approach, which you do, how do you break down the action, from the ongoing siege of Leningrad, which lasts for, correct me if I'm wrong, at least 18 months, maybe almost around that time, all the way down to, the center and then down to the Ukraine. You are dealing with hundreds and hundreds of, kilometer long front lines. How
Yes.
do you condense that into an understandable narrative for the listener to kind of follow along?
Yes, it is difficult. So while I find it a bit frustrating that a lot of the discussion of in a lot of history books, whether it's about the Eastern Front or aspects of the Western Front and so on, are very much episodic and they focus also geographically, and it
Hmm.
makes it difficult to understand that full context. You don't really understand that while the Commonwealth forces are holding up at Tobruk, right?
Yeah,
The Germans are pressing in the southern Ukraine and around Rostov.
exactly.
So, um, and because it is such a huge front, it's 1,500 no, 1,800 kilometers from the Baltic Sea at
Yeah.
Leningrad down to the Black Sea. And then, of course, there was some action, not a great deal, in the very far north along the Barents Sea. So I have had to focus, entire episodes on, okay, here's an aspect and focus geographically. So I did a short series, 2 or 3 episodes back when I started out on that very far north action
Yeah.
from Finland toward Murmansk, which failed. So largely it was fairly static for most of the war, but there's just no way around it.
Yeah.
I did try in 2 recent episodes to say, okay, I'm going to do the whole Eastern Front, but I'm going to have to go and do it chronologically, but I'm going to have to keep zipping north and south
Mm.
because,
Mm.
in January 6th, this happened near Leningrad, and on the 7th, this happened near Kiev.
Mm.
And so it gets confusing. And here's my
Yeah,
cat making an appearance.
absolutely. No worries. I guess you also are using your website and you're using maps as well to help you tell the story, aren't you? To kind of really give some kind of visual aids to the listener to follow along the action as you're describing it on the podcast.
Yeah, and I think that's because, again, especially in the West, we're not that familiar with the geography, so where these cities are in relation
Right.
to one another. And
Right.
so, yeah, I do try to post historical maps. Fortunately, there are some open source, a lot of open source maps and other images available, and I find those really helpful.
Oh, good. I've taken to the option of creating my own maps via Google Maps. I did that to kind of plot the journey of the Ninth Army in my Halber story, and then for this series on Boughton, I was using this map to plot all the various village names which I referenced in the story, but which no one would
Oh,
know are located because that's when I found the old campaign maps were perhaps a little bit inefficient and just explain, but it sounds like
yeah.
you've taken the right approach there to try and give the listener as much detail as possible.
Yeah. Another challenge is that if you're going to use Soviet era maps, all
Mm.
the lettering is in Cyrillic, and
Oh God,
I
yeah,
don't think many of my listeners can read. I can sort of, but and I find there's just too much detail, especially if you're
yeah.
looking at it on a fairly small screen. It just more confusing than helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you've mentioned before, I just want to maybe riff on was at the start of your podcast episodes, you try to give an overview of what's happening elsewhere at the same time. And
Hmm.
one thing that's always struck me is how much coordination was there between the Allied powers, where if the Allies were launching a major Western theater operation or campaign, how much did the Soviets know about this in advance, and then try to exploit that in pressurizing Germany from both sides? So one
Mm.
example I know about, which maybe you can talk more about, is as the Allied invasion of Sicily is being launched and is kind of playing out, that's around about the same time as Kursk is happening in the east, and it's that dual pressure which is just ramping up or tightening the noose on Germany's ability to fight a two-front war.
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't think that the Soviets were all that cooperative with the West.
Hmm.
And it was, in fact, yes, Stalin was unsatisfied. He wanted a second front, but he wanted a second front in France and was
Mm,
famously not satisfied with the invasion of Sicily and Italy. However, yes, that was about the same time as Kursk was happening.
mm,
And the thinking of Kursk was, you know, to draw the Germans in
mm,
as much as possible and build all those defensives and circle them. Now, Hitler did divert a number of divisions from the Eastern Front
mm.
to Italy to defend in Italy, especially when
Right,
Mussolini's government fell.
right.
Um, it-
In the
Hitler
wake of the
decided,
Sicily invasion. Right.
yes,
Yeah.
and so then Hitler was quite he said, "Yeah, if the Italians won't hold Italy, then I will."
Yeah.
But and they did put up I mean, it's famous the slog through the valleys and mountains of Italy.
Yes. Yeah.
But it did divert forces from the east at a time when they could least afford it.
Mm, mm,
They were still a a formidable army. In fact, and I just mentioned this, I came across the fact that at the beginning of 1944, the German armed forces in total were the greatest they'd ever been. They had
wow.
9 million men in arms at
Wow.
that point, but they were suffering in terms of productivity. And the other thing that doesn't get enough credit, I guess, in the West is just by that point, 1943, the Soviets' factories, armaments factories, tanks and airplanes and guns and everything were operating at full bore at that time.
Right.
Um, and so they were bringing more and more ammunition and still bringing more and more armies into the field, whereas German ability to produce was falling back.
Exactly.
Uh, Not only in terms of it's still in 1943, they were still producing a lot, but they didn't
Mm,
have the sort of mass production
no.
ethos that the States and Russia or the Soviet Union had at
Mm,
that point.
mm.
And so
Yeah.
Germany was decreasing as the Soviets were increasing. And we see that through 1943, especially in 1944.
Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I wanted to maybe touch upon was how much of an impact did the Allied like loan or the leasing of equipment really impact the Soviet Union's ability to fight the war on the Eastern Front. I've read many stories about how, US Jeeps were shipped over, and the English writing on the trucks was hardly written over with Cyrillic to
Yes.
give the impression that it wasn't actually American equipment on the ground. But just how pivotal was this to the Red Army's ability to really beat Germany in the end?
It was absolutely critical. So in 1941, when they started shipments, and even in just that year, those shipments were significant. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but
Mm, mm,
millions of tons of well, first of all, supplies, ammunition, food was crucial.
yeah.
Um, in my book on the Eastern Front, the first part, Army of War and Souls, this is something my father-in-law Maurice told me about.
Wow.
Was, they were in 1941 they were starving. They just didn't have the amount of food. But by the 1940s or
Hmm.
later in the war, all these American supplies started coming in, and
Hmm.
they were eating so well. And they really liked Spam. They really liked the canned ham. He said
Who
it was very
doesn't?
popular. Yeah, very popular. But yeah, and you just look at the statistics on the Lend-Lease program. All the British and American tanks and other
Mm,
vehicles, especially in 1942, were prevented the complete collapse of the
mm,
Soviet Union.
mm,
And those factories that were moved and then reassembled and then started coming on stream, an important element of that is that they were using mass production techniques and management practices brought to the USSR by American engineers.
wow.
So, like Christie, who developed the famous British tanks and
Hmm.
the American tanks, they were using those designs for the suspension and the drivetrains and so on for their tanks. So,
Wow.
yeah, that was absolutely that made the difference. And the great masses of forces that the Soviets were able to bring to the Eastern Front to overwhelm the Germans, really. Yeah, it was the Soviets supplying the numbers,
Mm, mm,
but without the Lend-Lease supplies of trucks and of even railroads.
mm,
I have a statistic, especially at the beginning of the war, they sent like rails, steel
hmm.
rails,
Literally
for
rails. Wow.
rails and locomotives. And in one of my episodes, I have a photo of a locomotive being unloaded from a port, probably Archangel.
Staggering.
Yeah, just to think of what kind
Yeah.
of crane you have to use to lift a locomotive off of a ship onto a rail.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's incredible. Just to mention Archangel and the sacrifice of the Arctic convoys, bringing the
Hmm.
equipment over, which I imagine doesn't get the attention perhaps in the Russian historiography about the war as it should do. Just like with the Lend-Lease programs, I'm sure the Russians don't touch upon that maybe as strongly as they should.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe get your opinion. So my podcast focuses on the end of the war or the end of the war on the Eastern Front, and yours has obviously started from Operation Barbarossa.
Yeah.
When I was thinking of questions of what to ask you, I perhaps naively thought, well, the Soviets are still making some pretty shocking mistakes in April 1945. Surely they professionalized or got better at fighting the war, conducting the war throughout the previous 4 years. So I just wanted to know, did they improve at all from the kind of calamity of the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa to the end of the war in 1945? Did the army professionalize in terms of tactics and strategy at all?
Yeah, yeah, I did look into that. And there's and I know I've come across that question or the idea of the professionalization
Mm,
of the Red Army. Um, there are some aspects that they indeed did, but still, even throughout the war, you can see at Silo Heights or in the Battle of Berlin, they were
yeah,
still using the focus was we've got these numbers, got this overwhelming force. We outnumber the Germans, 4, 5, 10 to 1.
yeah,
So that's kind of where that was the idea. That was what
yeah.
led to the success. But saying that, Yeah, there were some important changes. So in 1941, at the launch of Barbarossa, there were a lot of commanders who were there primarily because they were Stalin's buds.
Right.
So men like Budyonny and famously Voroshilov failed and made, old-fashioned mistakes, especially Budyonny,
Mm,
yeah, and Voroshilov too, were tended to focus on World War One tactics and Russian Civil War tactics. Budyonny was the
mm.
dashing cavalry officer with the big mustache. And yeah, that, mustaches don't win wars,
No.
apparently.
Hitler can tell you that.
Yeah, but so they were fired. Voroshilov was the one who lost,
Mm,
in the Winter War against Finland until he was sacked and Timoshenko was brought in.
mm,
But even Timoshenko by 42 was pretty considered kind of an old-fashioned commander.
mm,
So after that, we start to see people like, Zhukov really rises, and he's because he is successful.
mm,
And so you see more commanders being promoted because they are able to react and make changes. Eventually, again, like Hitler, Stalin at the beginning of the war said, not one step back, and, ordered anyone who was
mhm.
retreated to be shot. But eventually, as the war progresses, Stalin starts to give more initiative to the commanders in the field,
Right.
because
But yeah.
especially those who are capable, like, at first Timoshenko, Zhukov, Konev,
Mm,
Vatutin, uh, Moskalenko. That name always kills me because Moskalenko is a Ukrainian name
I
that
was gonna
means
say.
man from Moscow.
Oh well.
But yeah, people like that, they proved their ability,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because of that, they were promoted. And also, so many, junior officers, non-commissioned officers were killed,
Yeah.
and so the ones who survived were the guys who, yeah, the ones who ended up being a command were there because they survived and because they knew how to survive.
Because they survived. This freedom, I might say, I mean, this relative freedom which
Mhm,
Stalin would give his senior commanders was something that came up to me in my research for the Battle of the Halbe Pocket and the Battle of Berlin, which I'm working on now, where Stalin challenged Zhukov and Konyev to say, right, whom or which one of you can present to me the best plan for the
mhm,
assault on Berlin? Yes, he knew that they were rivals, and this was obviously
mhm,
an unspoken challenge to both men. But contrast that with Hitler, who is an absolute micromanaging,
mhm.
despot who is dictating policy and military strategy, even though he doesn't know how to do it himself. It just a very stark contrast. And despite all of Stalin's other failings, which are many, it would have to be the one thing that goes into the plus column. He did allow his commanders some relative freedom to come up with the best strategy for the right phase of the war in which they were fighting.
Yes, that and again, yeah, I think it was just, maybe it's, the realism as opposed to the ideology. Stalin was an ideologue, of course, but
Yeah.
he was very much, a practical person, I guess robbing banks, teaches you to think on your feet, I don't know. Um, and again, but also a very different experience. So
Mm,
Hitler, yeah, micromanaged everything and told his generals where to go and how to do it. And in 1941 to 1942, he was right. He'd proved right. I mean, they were successful. They
mm.
reached Leningrad. They got to the, 19, was it 19 miles from Moscow?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and then got to the Volga River in 1942. So, you can't argue with success.
No.
But then, apparently you can argue with failure. So, Stalin, I think, saw that when the commanders in the field did have successes with their own, ideas,
Mm.
yeah, we'll just do more of that, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
Zhukov did successfully defend, Leningrad held the Germans back, but then on the
Mm.
other hand, Hitler changed the orders. Say, yeah, we're not going to take Leningrad, we're just going to destroy it and we're going to turn it into a
Starve it
park.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess one thing with them, so I guess to summarize that, it's the ends justify the means as long as it's a successful end. So we touched upon the Zelo Heights as kind of the other bookend, perhaps,
Hmm.
of the war in terms of like major battles. And Zhukov is making what I would classify as some pretty basic, some incredible mistakes there.
Hmm.
The famous anecdote of him using the 140 searchlights to, like, shine onto the German defenders, but ended up blinding his own troops, especially when they turn them off and turn them back on again, and this whole thing. And that, in part, led to the outcome where, yes, they won the battle, but I think over 30,000 Soviet soldiers died.
Yeah.
Now,
So
if it was a British, general or commander who was producing that number of losses, it would still be seen as a failure, even if the battle was won. But in Soviet terms, the culture is different, and the high body count does not count as failure, if that's the right way to characterize how the Red Army operated during the war.
yeah, I think that's a theme that you can see from the very beginning is just throw numbers at them. In I forget which battle it was. In the winter of 1941, as the Germans were advancing, um, the there was an example where the Red Army soldiers linked arms and charged in a line at the Germans, which is just
Incredible.
like, yeah, it's just like mass suicide. I can't think of any other uh, way to explain it.
No, absolutely, and that is, again, that's almost First World War
Mm.
tactics.
Yeah,
Um, being fought against an army that has quite good machine guns and can, take
yes,
advantage of
yeah,
that. Absolutely. So, talking more about strategy, the Soviet broad front strategy was a favorite of theirs, and
yes,
this remains remarkably consistent throughout the war. I think
right.
you would agree with saying. What are the drawbacks of that, in your opinion? Because I certainly see drawbacks of that when it comes to the final battle against Berlin and in Saxony, but I wanted to hear your thoughts. Does that strategy have any failings, and does it fail at any time in previous parts of the war?
Well, it did fail. There were a number of attacks that just didn't work. So the idea of the broad front, the big picture of it is attack everywhere. And it's an 1,800-kilometer front, so
Mm,
attack
mm,
everywhere all the time, and then sooner or later, somewhere that the enemy has to break.
right,
Just, just by numbers. And then when they do start to break, and then that becomes we start to see the deep penetration strategy. And this was something that Zhukov was part of the development of even before the war, this approach to the war. So when you do see a break, then you start to pour as much as you can into that.
right,
So
right,
you get the initial troops, the shock troops or whatever, make a break, they advance a certain amount, and then you send in the reserves. They go as deep as they can into the
right,
enemy's operational areas, so their rear areas, and that way you can disrupt their logistics, um, and take over their supplies or destroy their supplies so that they are hampered from
right,
responding or counterattacking. And then, and we see this in various places, you can encircle the forces on either side of that breakthrough.
right.
And so it's a great theory. The drawback, it is very costly. So you have to have the numbers, and
Mm,
not just of soldiers, but you've got to have the ammunition, you've got to have the guns, you've got to have the tanks and airplanes.
mm, mm,
So it was dependent on what the Soviet Union could bring to bear in terms of numbers of resources.
mm,
And it's a sledgehammer approach, and
mhm,
at the early parts of the war, you can see that the cost is very high, and the Soviet Union wasn't ready,
mm,
especially in the summer of 1941, when so much, especially their Air Force, was just almost completely wiped out.
mm, mm,
But their forces were not arrayed efficiently, so they were quickly taken out. And so when you've only got bodies to throw at armored forces,
Yeah,
especially when the enemy is also very strong, then that's where the disadvantages come in.
absolutely. Yeah, and they were able to trade space for time, with the huge, land mass which they had, then they were able to pull back and, the scorched earth policy to at least buy themselves some time in the early part of the war. No, thank you for that. I had another maybe tangent question. So, in my current series, I'm looking at the Battle of Bautzen, and
Mhm.
a key part of that story is the performance of the Polish Second Army, which is part of the overall Polish People's Army.
Right.
And I'm dealing with it at the end of the war, and this is the first time that the Second Army even enters the battlefield. It's their baptism of fire, and it's a very bloody one.
Mhm.
No spoilers, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the origins of the Polish People's Army as a concept, and just how perhaps cynical was the creation of that army in terms of furthering the post-war Soviet agenda. I don't want to lead you too much with my question, but
Sure. I like this because this really points out just how complex the war on the Eastern Front was. It was, it's easy to see it as, Germany goes at this gigantic foe who's disorganized and backward, and
mhm,
the Soviets win because they've got all these numbers. But it's actually really complex, and there's a lot of different competing interests happening, especially when you break down into the individual Eastern Bloc countries. So Poland, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine,
right,
Belarus, and then it gets even more complex the further west you go. And also in Russia, there's a lot of many, many different ethnicities as well, with
mm,
varying levels of loyalty to the concept of the Soviet Union.
mm,
But so when you get to Poland, it's I think a quite illuminating, simplified a bit. So in 1939, in September, Germany invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. That everybody knows that. Not as many people realize or think about 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east,
mm,
and the two sides met at the demarcation line and shook hands after some initial tension.
mhm,
And so then what you get is the Polish government goes into exile, and the Navy and the Air Force, what was left of it,
mm,
escape as well. And you get the establishment of what's called the Polish Home Army, or they just call it the Home Army, or
mm.
AK. I'm not going to try to pronounce Polish. I'm not good at that.
I,
um,
I wouldn't
but
know how accurate it would be anyway, but I won't put you under pressure. Don't worry.
but that left a number of partisan groups in Poland. Now, there were a number of groups, actually, at least that I found three different organizations called the Polish People's Army. So
Mm,
it gets a little confusing. But
mm,
I guess so we've got the Home Army, which is, an underground or partisan army operating in Poland, and they are loyal to the Polish government in exile in London.
mm,
And then you've got left-leaning people, uh, socialists who put together some organizations uh,
mm.
within Poland. And also, then we get a Polish People's Army established after 1941
Yeah.
by the Soviets, comprising largely Polish POWs in the Soviet Union.
Mm,
And so that becomes the nub of the Polish People's Army. One corps was so-called became known as the Anders Army,
mm,
and the idea was that they would fight alongside the Red Army.
right.
Um, Now, interestingly, in 1942, they were sent to the a brief Middle Eastern conflict when Germany was impinging on the Levant.
Oh yeah.
And largely Australian and British Commonwealth forces
Yeah.
opposed them. The Polish, this the First Division, the Anders Army, was sent there through Iran,
Wow.
and then passed under British command. So
Right.
then they became part of that whole Polish British command there.
Right. Right. Right.
Now, the other half of it became known as Berling's army or
Mm.
Berling's army,
General
so
Burling. Yeah.
under General Berling, and it reached as many as 30,000 members. So it was a corps,
Mm.
and they again fought alongside the Soviet, the Red Army, and it was this corps that did reach Warsaw during in the summer of 1944,
Right.
uh, and participated. They did get to the banks of the Vistula River,
Yeah.
but suffered heavy, heavy losses. And of course, the rest of the Red Army did not. There's a
Mm.
lot of debate over why not.
Mm.
Was it, they were just exhausted. They were not able to go into Warsaw to support the uprising,
Yeah.
or was it a deliberate strategy by Stalin to let,
Wow.
the non-communist home army
Mm.
exhaust itself against the Germans, and then it would be easier for the Red Army to take control when these two armies had, wiped each other out.
Mm. I'm inclined to believe the latter, that it was a deliberate ploy, or at least the way it turned out was heavily, conducive to what Stalin's long-term goal was, of installing a pro-Soviet communist puppet state in Poland, or
Yes.
at least a communist-leaning government. And so wiping out the Home Army was the first step to that. And after the war finished, the Home Army members continue to be prosecuted, and they are, well, I mean, persecuted would be the better word for it, even after the war. But no, I always found that the way that the Soviets, they do use the war. I think at some point in the war, it stops being this existential threat to the existence of the Soviet Union and starts becoming a tool for how Eastern Europe more broadly, and Poland in particular, can fall under their control in the long term. And I found the Polish People's Army, or the various armies that you listed, as a very kind of cynical but obvious way in which that manifests itself. With very varying results. I mean, I won't spoil how the Bautzen story ends, but the Polish People's Armies, which are put into the field as part of the operations in Saxony and on Bautzen, do not perform very well, given the lack of experience in the officer corps and in the infantry as well. And also because the Soviets did their tactic of just filling up the officer corps with transfers from the normal Red Army. And they
Mhm.
tried to find Russians with dubious Polish ancestry, which is my favorite. Was my favorite line. Um,
Dubious Polish answers, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
the people who maybe they had a Polish granddad, maybe not. Um, they probably barely spoke Polish, if at all, but they became the part of the officer corps for this new Polish People's Army, which is just again, yeah, and as you can imagine, that doesn't lead to much love lost between the infantry and the officers. But
No.
anyway,
No, no, and
yeah,
yeah, apparently what I did find is about 40% of the officers of the Polish Home Army, no, sorry, the Polish People's Army
hmm,
were Soviet or Russian,
yeah,
or
exactly,
and again, and an interesting thing is Rokossovsky was Polish or part Polish, and that's a
yes.
Polish name, but he wasn't in the Polish People's Army. He was commanding the at this point the Second Byelorussian Front. So.
Exactly. Very, very good. What maybe not to throw a curveball in here. One fascinating part of the Eastern Front that I've always felt was overlooked, certainly from the West, was the role of Finland in the kind of conflict
Mm,
in general. I mean, they were allied with Germany. Obviously, we know the reasons why. It's a continuation of the Winter War in that
yes.
sense. But how do they perform on the Eastern Front? And is the performance of the Finnish forces one reason why the battles up in the northern kind of part of the Eastern Front, why they become static? Or is it other factors such as Hitler's decision not to crush Leningrad, but rather starve it out? I wanted just to hear your opinion on how the Finnish forces, how do they perform as allies of Germany?
Well, they perform remarkably well, even before, like the original Winter War, um, in 1930, 39 to 40,
940. Yeah.
um, they inflicted five times the casualties that they suffered. Um, and it was only when Timoshenko decided, yeah, we're just going to bring an overwhelming force,
Mm,
that they finally had to capitulate. And at that point, they weren't getting a lot of support from Germany because at that point, Germany was allied with the Soviet Union.
mm.
Um, and then, in the far north, the Operation Arctic Fox, which was along the Barents Sea, again, it largely failed, and for a lot of reasons. And one of the main reasons was the German officers and leaders there weren't listening to the Finns.
Oh,
They,
really?
they had their philosophy of battle, their approach, and
Mm.
this is working on the steppes, yeah, but not in the boreal forest. So,
Oh,
uh,
wow. Yeah. Very different terrain.
yes. So also the Finns did so they in the later part of what they called the continuation war. So
Mhm.
after 1941, they penetrated around Lake Ladoga. They did not link up on the eastern side of Lake Ladoga, as I think that was the original plan or
Mm.
vision
Okay.
of Hitler and of his generals. But yeah, they did advance along the Karelian Isthmus. I don't, as far as I know, they were not willing to go into Leningrad.
Okay.
Um, let's let the Germans deal with that. They
Mm.
held the line. They blockaded it as far as they could from
Mm.
the Gulf to Finland to Lake Ladoga, but they were not willing to go much farther than that.
Okay, I guess their prime concern was reclaiming the territory they had lost, obviously, when they
Mhm,
had surrendered to the Soviets, and that makes sense. I wanted to maybe just ask you more broadly, about the Eastern Front. I've got a very privileged position here in Berlin that I'm
mm,
able to go and walk the ground.
mhm.
About the battles that I'm writing about or that I'm talking about on my podcast. Have you visited any kind of battlegrounds in say the broad Eastern Front? And if not, do you hopefully plan to? I mean, maybe when things calm down, hopefully in the future, and you can visit more freely.
Yes, well, I haven't had a chance yet. Now, ironically, my wife and I had been talking about our next European trip would be to Ukraine,
Oh wow,
uh, and then
yeah.
February 2022 happened. So, um, yeah, I really do hope to visit at some point, and battle zones and
Mm.
historical areas will be a focus.
One more thing. So what are the plans for your podcast? Are you intending then to really follow the chronology of the Eastern Front all the way up to the fall of Berlin in 45? Or is that your end point? Or do you maybe see it, continuing in some format after that?
That's something I've been thinking about lately because, as you know, into 1944 now, I had intended absolutely to go into 1945, the fall of Berlin, and also beyond that, the first couple of years at least of the occupation. I probably
Mhm.
by that point, though, I won't be going as strictly chronologically as
Mm,
I am now.
mm.
But for example, Maurice's story, my father-in-law's story of being in the Red Army, and he did, participate in the fall of Berlin,
Oh wow.
um, and then he went down to as a Canadian citizen. He was intent on getting back to Canada.
Yeah.
Ended up being going to Munich, and then ended up in Vienna. And it was in Vienna he got the found the right connections and support
Oh
to
wow.
repatriate. And then I'm kind of thinking maybe I'll look into the Cold War. I know there are already podcasts about the Cold War, but
Hmm.
I haven't really had a chance yet to think about my focus, my approach to that.
Interesting. It's really, really interesting. There's an absolute treasure trove of stories, and things that can be focused on. The war, in many ways, the legacy of the Second World War shapes the entire European story, then for the following 60 years until the end of the Cold War, and then you could
Mhm.
argue it's still obviously impacting in many ways today. So yeah, this is why I think the Second World War is always a story I go back to, because you don't understand today's stories without understanding them. Obviously, the history of
Yeah,
where it was all shaped from, and the Second World War was the main anchor point of the 20th century in forming the world we have today.
exactly. And I have tried to point that out that, the decisions made during and then immediately after the Second World War really have endured.
Yeah.
We obviously through the Cold War and the division of Europe up to 1990, but even now, the alignments are there now. I think we're at another inflection point right
Mm,
now. Um,
absolutely.
but I don't know the future any better than anyone else.
No,
So,
no, 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 no one does. So, I'll kind of wrap it up now and give you the opportunity to share with my listeners, where can they find your stuff? Where can they follow you? Obviously, the podcast I'll be linking to in the episode description and sharing with all of my audiences. But you have a
great.
website, other projects. How can they consume your content?
Well, the easiest way to do it is to go to beyondbarbarossa.ca.
Hmm.
And that's kind of a placeholder, and that links to the actual website, which is
Hmm.
beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. But it might just be easier to remember the .ca.
Perfect.
And I think everybody, if they're listening to this podcast, they can spell Barbarossa. And so there's the website there, and then it's available as a podcast on all the podcasting platforms, Apple and Stitcher and Podbean and what's the big one? Spotify.
Everywhere. Yeah.
And I think it's also available through Amazon if you're interested in pursuing it that way.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Well, I'll share that with my audience and encourage everyone to keep listening to your show. If they want to have the full story of the Eastern Front from start to finish in all of its glory and horror, then Scott has got the podcast for you, and I think it's a perfect companion to my Europe at War podcast as well. So thank you, Scott, for joining me today, and thank you
Well,
for talking to to my listeners and to the audience.
well, thank you very much, David, for having me. It was a pleasure and informative to answer all your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Scott. Looking forward to chatting to you again soon.
Well, great. Me too.
Take care.
See you. Take care. Bye bye.